I never used to mind the silence of this office building at 3 in the morning, but tonight, the stillness feels less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. My job as the night security lead for the Sterling Plaza is usually mind-numbingly boring, consisting mostly of watching grainy monitors and making sure the cleaning crews don't leave the side doors propped open. But tonight, the air in the lobby feels heavy and cold, and every time I glance at the bank of screens in front of me, I feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that I just cannot shake. It started an hour ago when I saw a delivery driver enter through the loading dock on the basement level, wearing a bright red vest and carrying a thermal bag as if he were dropping off a late-night snack for one of the coders on the 14th floor. I watched him enter the elevator and press the button, but when I checked the 14th floor cameras 5 minutes later, the hallway was completely empty and the elevator was sitting idle on the lobby level again. Where did he go in those few minutes, and why did the motion sensors in the stairwell suddenly flicker to life when there shouldn't be a soul in there? I leaned forward, my face inches from the glass of the monitor, heart hammering a slow and steady rhythm against my ribs as I rewound the footage from the loading dock. There was something wrong with the way he moved, a strange, calculated stiffness to his gait that didn't match the casual look of a food courier. As I zoomed in on his face, I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that he wasn't looking at the elevator buttons at all, but was staring directly into the lens of the security camera with a wide, fixed grin. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, and he knew that I was sitting here, alone in the dark, watching him play this sick game of hide and seek. I reached for my radio to call the off-site dispatch, but all I got was a wall of static that hissed in my ear like a nest of disturbed snakes. I tried the landline on the desk, but the dial tone was dead, severed by someone who clearly knew the layout of the building's basement wiring better than I did. That was when the lights in the security hub began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the pens in my desk drawer before the entire room plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. I sat frozen in my chair, my eyes straining to adjust, the only light coming from the tiny, glowing red recording lights on the dead monitors. Then, the most terrifying thing happened. The center monitor flickered back to life, but it wasn't showing the lobby or the loading dock anymore. It was showing a live feed of my own desk, a view from the camera mounted directly behind my head, and I could see my own back trembling in the chair. And there, standing just at the edge of the frame, was the man in the red vest, holding a long, rusted piece of rebar that he must have pulled from the construction site in the basement. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, panicked gasp that felt like swallowing glass as I realized he was only inches away from me in the dark. I didn't scream because I knew that if I made a sound, it would give him the satisfaction of knowing he had already won the psychological war. Instead, I slowly rolled my chair to the left, feeling the wheels creak against the linoleum floor, every tiny sound feeling like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the room. I reached out my hand, feeling for the heavy industrial flashlight I always kept on the edge of the desk, my fingers brushing against the cold metal just as I heard a soft, wet chuckle from the corner of the room. He was moving closer, his boots making no sound on the floor, a ghost in a red vest who had turned my sanctuary into a tomb. I swung the flashlight with everything I had, not at him, but at the glass partition of the security office, the shattering sound echoing through the lobby like a lightning strike. The sudden noise startled him just enough for me to bolt through the jagged opening, the glass cutting into my palms as I scrambled into the open space of the lobby. I didn't head for the front doors because I knew he would have jammed them from the outside, so I ran toward the service corridor that led to the industrial kitchen. My lungs were burning, each breath feeling like it might be my last as I ducked behind a stainless steel prep table, the smell of industrial cleaner and old grease filling my nose. I could hear his footsteps now, a slow, rhythmic thud-thud-thud that told me he wasn't in a rush, because he thought I was trapped in this maze of steel and shadows. I reached into my pocket and found my personal cell phone, but there was no signal in this part of the building, the thick concrete walls acting as a natural shield against the outside world. How could a person navigate a dark building so perfectly without a light, unless they had been planning this for weeks or months? I watched his silhouette pass the kitchen door, the red vest appearing as a dull, dark smudge against the moonlight filtering in from the high windows. He stopped, tilting his head as if listening for the sound of my heart, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from sobbing in terror. He started dragging the metal rebar across the edge of the steel tables, a screeching, metallic sound that set my teeth on edge and made me want to bolt into the open just to make it stop. He was trying to flush me out, playing with his prey, savoring the fact that I was cornered in a room with only one real exit. But he didn't know about the dumbwaiter, a small manual lift used for moving supplies to the executive dining room, which was hidden behind a false panel in the pantry. I began to crawl, my knees scraping against the cold tile, moving with an agonizing slowness that felt like it took hours just to cover a few feet. I could hear him talking to himself now, a low, melodic mumbling about how the lights are out and the birds are quiet, a nursery rhyme twisted into something foul and threatening. I reached the pantry and felt for the recessed handle of the dumbwaiter, my fingers trembling so violently that I nearly dropped the latch. I slid inside the tiny, cramped wooden box, the smell of dust and old wood pressing in on me as I pulled the rope to lift myself upward. The pulley groaned, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and I saw the red-vested man turn toward the pantry with a look of pure, predatory hunger on his face. He lunged for the opening just as I cleared the floor, his fingers grazing the bottom of my shoe as the manual lift carried me into the dark shaft. I climbed out on the 3rd floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest, and I immediately ran for the emergency fire escape on the north side of the building. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the heavy thud of him hitting the pantry floor below or the sound of his frustrated screams echoing up the shaft. I burst through the fire door, the cold night air hitting my face like a blessing from heaven, and I didn't stop running until I saw the blue and red lights of a patrol car turning the corner 3 blocks away. When the police finally entered the building, they found the red vest discarded in the lobby and the security wires professionally cut. But the man was gone, vanished back into the shadows of the city. I never went back to the Sterling Plaza, and even now, years later, I cannot sit in a quiet room without looking over my shoulder, wondering if the man with the fixed grin is still out there, waiting for the lights to go out again. I have always been the kind of person who double-checks the locks before going to bed, but tonight, the cold realization that my safety was an illusion hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I am staying in a remote, wood-paneled Airbnb in the hills of North Carolina, a place that looked charming in the photos but feels increasingly like a cage as the sun dips below the jagged horizon. The house is beautiful in a rustic way, yet every floorboard seems to groan under the weight of a secret, and the wind whistling through the surrounding pines sounds far too much like a human whisper. It all started an afternoon ago when I noticed the latch on the large, ornate window in the guest bedroom wouldn't quite click into place, leaving a tiny, barely visible gap between the frame and the glass. I reached out to the host, a man named Elias who had a voice as dry as parchment, and he assured me it was just the house settling and that the window was stuck fast from the outside. But as I stood there in the fading twilight, I noticed a single muddy fingerprint on the white paint of the interior sill, a smudge that definitely hadn't been there when I checked in 3 hours earlier. The sun has finally disappeared, leaving the forest in a state of absolute, ink-black darkness that seems to press against the glass of the living room windows. I am sitting on the sofa with a book I haven't turned a page of in 20 minutes, my ears straining to catch any sound that isn't the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every shadow in the corner of the room seems to elongate and shift, playing tricks on my tired eyes until I am convinced that someone is standing just out of sight. I decided to head to the bedroom to try and sleep off this growing paranoia, but as I walked past the guest room, I saw something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The window that was supposed to be stuck fast was now wide open, the heavy velvet curtains snapping and billowing in the night breeze like the wings of a giant, dark bird. My heart began to throb in my throat, a frantic, rhythmic pulsing that made it hard to draw a full breath as I stared at the empty, dark rectangle where the glass should have been. I didn't run immediately, because my brain was trying to process the impossibility of the situation, wondering if the wind could have somehow forced the heavy sash upward. Then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from beneath the high, antique bed frame, like a fingernail slowly dragging across the hardwood floor. I froze, my hand still gripping the doorframe so hard that my knuckles turned a ghostly white, and I realized with a jolt of pure horror that I wasn't alone in this house. Someone was in the room with me, tucked away in the shadows under the dust ruffle, waiting for me to turn out the lights and climb into bed. I didn't scream, because I knew that the moment I showed my hand, the hunter would become the attacker, and I was miles away from the nearest neighbor or police station. I forced myself to take a slow, trembling breath, pretending to yawn loudly as I stepped back into the hallway, my mind racing through every possible escape route. I walked toward the kitchen, my legs feeling like leaden weights, and I picked up my phone from the counter, praying that the person under the bed hadn't heard the frantic pounding of my heart. I dialed the emergency number, but the signal in these mountains is a fickle thing, and the screen just showed a mocking, searching for service animation that felt like a death sentence. I could hear the floorboards in the guest room beginning to creak, a slow and deliberate sound that told me the intruder was crawling out from his hiding spot. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. He was letting me know that the game had changed and that he knew I was aware of his presence. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove, the cold metal feeling strangely grounding in my shaking hands, and I backed toward the heavy oak front door. I reached for the deadbolt, my fingers fumbling with the cold brass, but as I turned the handle, it didn't budge. The door had been jammed from the outside with a piece of wood or a metal rod. The intruder was now standing at the end of the long, narrow hallway, a tall, spindly figure silhouetted against the moonlight coming through the open guest room window. He didn't have a weapon in his hands, but he held them out in front of him like a sleepwalker, his fingers twitching in a way that suggested a frantic, nervous energy. "You shouldn't have looked at the window," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very air between us. I didn't wait for him to move. I turned and bolted toward the basement door, which was the only other exit I could think of in my state of blind, white-knuckle panic. I tumbled down the wooden stairs, the smell of damp earth and old coal dust filling my lungs as I reached the bottom and searched for the small coal chute window. It was a tiny opening, meant for shoveling fuel into the furnace decades ago, but it was my only chance to reach the world outside. I could hear him at the top of the basement stairs, his heavy boots thudding against the wood with a slow, agonizing deliberation that felt like he was savoring the moment. I scrambled onto an old wooden crate, the wood splintering under my weight, and I pushed against the rusted metal latch of the coal chute with every ounce of strength I had left. It groaned and resisted, the hinges screaming in protest, but finally, it swung outward, allowing a sliver of cold, fresh night air to hit my sweating face. I heard him start to descend the stairs, his breathing heavy and ragged, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice that made me scramble through the narrow opening with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. My jacket caught on a jagged piece of metal, tearing with a loud screech, but I kicked out blindly, feeling my shoe connect with something soft and yielding just as I tumbled onto the cold, damp grass outside. I didn't look back to see if he was following me through the chute. I simply ran into the woods, my feet hitting the pine needles with a frantic rhythm as I headed toward the main road. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs were shaking so violently that I collapsed onto the gravel shoulder of the highway just as a pair of headlights rounded the bend. It was a local utility truck, and the driver stopped immediately, his face a mask of concern as he saw my torn clothes and the look of sheer, haunting terror in my eyes. We called the police from his radio, and when they arrived at the house 20 minutes later, they found the front door still jammed and the guest room window wide open. The intruder was gone, but they found a small, handwritten note left on the pillow of the bed I was supposed to sleep in, which simply said, "I'll see you in your next dream." I never went back for my luggage, and I never stayed in a rental house again because now, every time I hear a window creak, I wonder if a latch is truly locked. The headlights of my old sedan were the only thing cutting through the thick, suffocating fog of Route 47, but as the engine gave a final, metallic gasp and died, I realized that the darkness was much heavier than I had ever imagined. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath my tires like breaking bone, and I sat there in the sudden, absolute silence of the forest while the heat from the engine dissipated into the damp night air. I reached for my phone, but the battery icon flickered red before the screen went black, leaving me with nothing but the faint smell of scorched oil and the sound of my own frantic breathing. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin, and that was when I saw it. A pair of high-beam lights appearing in the distance, moving slowly, hovering in the mist like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. They weren't moving at the speed of a normal traveler, but were crawling along the asphalt, pausing every few seconds as if searching for something specific in the ditch. I felt a surge of hope that quickly curdled into a cold, knotting dread as the vehicle drew closer, revealing itself to be a massive, rusted pickup truck with a custom steel bumper that looked more like a battering ram. It didn't pull up alongside me to offer help, but instead, it rolled past me for 50 yards before the brake lights flared a violent, angry red, and it began to slowly reverse. I stood frozen by my open car door, my hand gripping the cold metal frame so hard my fingers went numb. As the truck backed up until its rear bumper was inches from my front grille, the driver didn't get out, and the engine stayed running, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the soles of my shoes and seemed to mimic the frantic drumming of my heart. I watched the side mirror of the truck, catching a glimpse of a silhouette inside, a large figure that remained perfectly still, watching me through the reflection with a terrifying, singular focus. "Hey, do you need a jump start?" A voice finally called out, but it wasn't friendly or concerned. It was flat, monotone, and lacked any trace of human warmth. I shook my head, my voice catching in my dry throat as I managed to lie and say that a friend was already on the way with a tow truck. The figure in the truck didn't respond, but I heard the distinct, mechanical click of a door unlocking, and the driver's side door creaked open just a few inches. I didn't wait to see who or what was stepping out into the fog. I turned and scrambled over the guardrail, sliding down the steep, muddy embankment into the tall, wet grass of the valley floor. I could hear the heavy thud of a car door closing behind me, followed by the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement with a slow, deliberate pace that told me he wasn't worried about me getting away. I crouched low in the weeds, the moisture soaking through my jeans and chilling me to the bone, while I listened to him walking along the edge of the road above me. He was whistling a slow, distorted tune that sounded like a distorted lullaby, and every few seconds, the beam of a high-powered industrial flashlight would sweep across the grass, missing my head by only a few inches. How did he know exactly which direction I had run? And why did he seem so confident that I couldn't escape this stretch of wilderness? I began to crawl deeper into the marshy field, my hands sinking into the cold mud, trying to put as much distance between myself and the road as possible without making a sound. The tall grass hissed against my jacket, a sound that felt like 1,000 tiny voices warning me to keep moving or be found. Suddenly, the whistling stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the music had been. I stayed perfectly still, my face pressed into the dirt, holding my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst from the pressure. I heard a metallic clink, like the sound of a chain being dragged across a rock, and then the sound of him sliding down the embankment just as I had done moments before. He was in the tall grass with me now, and I could hear the reeds snapping under his weight as he began to move in a wide, sweeping circle, closing in on my position like a hunter herding a deer. I realized then that I couldn't just hide. I had to move, but the ground was becoming softer and more treacherous with every step I took. I saw a small, dilapidated hunting shack standing like a skeleton in the middle of the field, its wooden slats gray and rotting from years of neglect. It was a risky move, but it was the only cover for hundreds of yards, so I stayed low and scurried toward the door, my heart screaming at me to run faster. I slipped inside the shack, the smell of wet hay and old copper filling my nose, and I pressed myself against the back wall, clutching a jagged piece of broken floorboard as a makeshift weapon. I looked through a gap in the wood and saw the beam of his flashlight cutting through the fog, moving back and forth with a mechanical precision that felt inhuman. He was standing only 20 feet away, his silhouette towering over the grass, and I could see that he was carrying a long, heavy length of rusted tow chain over his shoulder. He began to speak, not to me, but to the darkness. His voice a low growl that sent shivers down my spine as he talked about how broken things need to be collected. I realized with a jolt of horror that my car hadn't broken down by accident. I remembered the small, sharp object I had seen in the road miles back, and I realized he had been following me for a long time, waiting for the trap to spring. He started walking toward the shack, his boots squelching in the mud, and I knew that if he stepped inside, I would be trapped with no way out. I looked up and saw a small, rusted hatch in the ceiling leading to a crawl space under the roof, and I scrambled up the wall with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I had. I pulled myself into the tiny, cramped space just as the door to the shack was kicked open with a violence that made the entire structure groan. I lay flat on the dusty boards, watching through the cracks as the man entered the room, the light of his flashlight illuminating the very spot where I had been standing seconds before. He let out a low, frustrated huff and swung the chain against a wooden post, the impact shaking the shack and sending a cloud of dust into my eyes. I had to bite my tongue to keep from sneezing, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth as I watched him pace the small room, his shadow dancing across the walls like a demon. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, searching every corner of the small room, before he finally turned and walked back out into the night, his footsteps fading into the distance. I waited in that cramped, dark space for 3 hours, not daring to move even a muscle until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the fog. I eventually climbed down and ran toward the main road, where a passing state trooper found me wandering in a daze, covered in mud and shivering from the cold. They found my car with the tires slashed and the engine wires cut, but the rusted pickup truck was long gone, leaving no trace behind but the deep, heavy ruts in the mud. I still don't drive at night if I can help it, because every time I see a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, I feel the weight of that rusted chain and the cold, damp breath of the fog.